Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to read through some history in regards to, certain situations of exploitation. And this was during the time of our forefather, Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah basically, was given permission to go back and rebuild, help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, right? So there was a big rebuilding process, the temple, and eventually the walls had to be basically rebuilt, because, and this is something that he dealt with in terms of, surrounding other nations, trying to not necessarily rebuke, but, basically mock, ridicule is probably the best word to use. He had to deal with, that because the other nations surrounding, they understood that, when we were more connected with our power, they know how they knew the terror of the Lord, and right, they knew how the Lord would fight for us and defend us when we were more closely connected, right? So that being said, I wanted to read a little bit of this, because it shows that within this time, there was a lot of oppression that was also taking place amongst our own people, and this is one of the things that that upset the Lord, because they did not operate in an understanding and having a fear of the Heavenly Father, right? And I'm reading this to kind of show the parallels of what happened back then, and basically what happens when you see these other situations coming out in regards to these other camps, when it comes to basically trying to exploit their own congregation. What I'm saying? Now, this situation I'm about to read is specifically surrounds usury, right? I don't want to get into that in a second, but it shows you the fruit of the mindset these nobles had back then, right? And why a lot of these camps, heads of camps, other camps, are very covetous. They're very greedy, right? And there's something in Timothy where it says when it comes to money, the love of money is the root of all evil. And they didn't you don't see that you see that strongly exemplified amongst these other congregations, right? The way they exploit their own people. And Jake is very, very well known for doing that and oppressing the poor, right? As a matter of fact, I read this. Let me read it again. I'll start off here. This is Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31, and it says that he that oppresseth the poor reproacheth his maker, but he that honoreth him hath mercy on the poor. Let me get it in the AMP here. This is in the AMP, and it says, he that oppresseth the poor taunt and insults his maker, but he is kind and merciful and gracious to the needy honors him, right? So, there was a certain level, we were supposed to deal with the poor of our own people, right? I know we have certain laws within our culture, that helps to actually maintain the welfare of the people who are essentially less fortunate, because it's you would have times when Jake would they might have had to mortgage fields, or they may have had to sell off land, and then maybe they might need somebody like a kinsman redeemer or so on and so forth to be able to buy back the land. So that land basically stays within the tribe, it stays within the clan, stays within the family. You know what I'm saying? So there's a good example of that in the book of Jeremiah, right? But the point, is that, there were times when we fell on hard times, right? But ultimately, we as a people, a lot of us were doing a lot of wicked things, and a lot of nobles, I should say, kings, nobles, there's many examples of that. And then there were different prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Micah, that were basically calling out a lot of the people, the heads, for doing a lot of things that were essentially contrary to the scriptures, right? They were doing things that were not pleasing in the sight of the Lord because they didn't have that fear. As a matter of, I'll read that. Let me get a, let me read that as well, actually, because if there's one pretty much key ingredient that's really just missing from the way that they treat their own congregation, really is they don't have a fear of the Lord, right? This is Sirach 1:18, and it says, the fear of the Lord is a crown of wisdom, making peace and perfect health to flourish, both which are gifts of the Most High, and enlargeth their rejoicing that love him, right? So, there is essentially, it produces really basically an uprightness. I'll read verse 20, and it says, the root of wisdom is fear of the Lord, and branches thereof are long life. The fear of the Lord driveth away sins, and when it is present, it turneth away wrath, right? So that's very important, because you see sins basically lying at the door of these other congregations. You know what I'm saying? When you see their behavior, when you see their fruits, when Yahushua spoke about a tree is known by its fruits, right? That word in the Greek there is karpos, which basically means a work or a deed, right? So you start to see the evil fruit that's coming out because they don't have that fear of the Lord. They don't have that mentality, So anyways, I ramble quite a bit, but, I'll get to the chapter here. This is Nehemiah chapter 5. Verse 1, and it says usury abolished, right? So I want to read a little bit of this chapter, and Lord's will, this will be edifying, right? So it says here in the AMP, it says, now there was a great outcry of the poor people and their wives against their brothers, to whom they were deeply in debt. For there was some who were saying, we, along with our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore, allow us to get grain so that we may eat and survive. There are others who are saying, we are mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our houses to buy grain because of the famine. And there was others who were saying, we have borrowed money on our fields and vineyards for the Persian king's heavy tax, right? So, this is basically different testimonies that are coming out, going on, around this time. So this is basically during the time of the kingdom of the Persians and the Medes, that captivity, right? So here, further on, this is verse 5, and it says, and our flesh is the same as that of our brothers, and our children are like their children, yet we are here forcing and selling our sons and our daughters to be slaves. And some of our daughters are forced into bondage already, and we are powerless to redeem them because our fields and our vineyards belong to others, right? So they don't have the power to actually be able to buy them back. You know what I'm saying? In terms of when it comes to servitude, amongst our own people, we have something within our culture, where, if a Hebrew man or a woman would be, basically they would work, for somebody like their own kin, they would work, they would serve them for 6 years, and the 7th year they would be released, right? This is, hold on, where was I? So this is where Nehemiah basically steps in. So this is verse 6, Nehemiah chapter 5. And it says here, then there I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words of accusation. I thought it over and then challenged the nobles and the rulers, and I said to them, you are exacting usury. So remember, they're already poor, because some of them had to sell off their children, to be slaves. Some of them had to mortgage their fields. Some of them, they don't have, there's a famine, right? So they don't have the abundance, right? They have to take their assets, so to speak, like, if they had a vineyard, or if they had grains, or if they had like what I'm saying, maybe you had some pomegranate trees, because we're a people who are very strongly tied to the land, right? Because that's what really represents abundance, is to have land, sheep, goats, cattle. You know what I'm saying? That's how you make your living. That's how you feed your family, your wives and your children. That's how you take care of, basically your household, right? So this is continuing on in verse 7. It says, you are exacting usury from your own brother, so essentially your own kin. So I held a great assembly to confront them. So let me go to the etymon line. So this was just another example here, as I'm reading, of oppression, right? So that was done by our own people. So this is usury in the etymon line, and it says the practice of lending money at interest. It says excessive rates of interest. It says from the Latin usuria, or from the Latin or alteration usura, payment for the use of money, interest, literally a usage, use, enjoyment, so basically, when you have that interest, like, if you have a credit card, there's like normally, like, there's like a 19% interest or whatever, 11% interest or whatever. There's the principal, and then there is that amount, right? They don't just, it's a way to collect more money, which is wicked, right? You're not supposed to be doing that, to your own people. Let me get 1 second. So at this point, you see how, furious Nehemiah was, because Nehemiah was a righteous individual. Let's get here. One second. This is Exodus chapter 22, verse 25. And it says, if thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, keep this in mind, this is your own people lending money, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither thou shalt lay upon him any usury. So this is not something that we're supposed to do. So you start to see, that covetous spirit. They're trying to make more. They're trying to oppress the poor. So just like how you have that oppression occurring amongst nobles, amongst, elders, amongst the rich of our own people back then, you will see that today. You want to see that same spirit today taking on many different versions. It may not necessarily be specifically usury, but it might take other forms where they're basically oppressing the poor, because ultimately our people are the poor, because we're socioeconomically, we don't actually have the wealth as so-called white people or Asians or Chinese and so on and so forth. When it comes to that, we like, as the curses say, we have to go to our enemies for the want of all things, right? So ultimately, there's a bunch of let me get it. It's in Jeremiah. Hold on. Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 26, and it says, for among my people are found wicked men. They lay wait, and they setteth snares. They set a trap, and they catch men. As a bird is full of cage, so are their houses full of deceit. They are Therefore they are become great and waxen rich. They waxen fat, yea, they shine. They overpass the deeds of the wicked. They judge not the cause, right? Because that's the role of, people who have those kinds of positions. They're supposed to possess some type of level of judgment, of healthy, sound judgment. But as you're seeing here, you start to see that, a lot of them were wicked, right? Verse 28 here, and it says here, they waxen fat, yea, they shine. They overpass the deeds of the wicked, they judge not the cause of the fatherless, yet they prosper, and the judge of the needy do they not judge, right? Shall I not visit for these things, saith the Lord, right? So, ultimately, a lot of these camps, their congregation, their heads, will feel and be visited by the Lord. And it's not like a polite, knock on the door. You know what I'm saying? The way that they actually treat, your own people like that. They're not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. Right? So I'll read a little bit more here of what Nehemiah, actually, said. Right? So it says here, this is Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 8. And it says, I said to them, according to our ability, we have redeemed our brothers who were sold to the Gentile nations, right? The other nations. And it says, now would you even sell your brothers that they might be sold unto us? Then they were silent and could not find a single word to say. So Nehemiah, basically, he rebuked them, right? And it says, so I said, what you're doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our power, Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, to prevent the taunting of the other nations, right? Our enemies, right? So, this is why, that's why that fear is really important, because what does it say in Deuteronomy? It says, keep therefore and do them, because this is your wisdom and decide in the other nations. They shall look at you and say, this nation is so great. But this is what Nehemiah is referring to. Like, you don't walk in a particular way where now we're not even essentially an example of righteousness of how to be. Basically, the way you're behaving right now and mistreating your own people like that, you're basically becoming a laughing stock. And just like it's the same mindset, today. When you see Jake's lewd behavior, amongst whether it's amongst Israel or it's amongst our people as a whole, when you see their lewd behavior when they go about, especially our women, when they go traveling into the other nations, they don't know how to conduct themselves. They have no behavior. They have no, rule over their spirit. They're basically taking their Babylonian mentalities and they're bringing it into the eyes of these other nations. That's why the other nations, they look at you and they're like, yo, we don't want you here. You're basically an infamy among the people. You're not famous for being good. You're just you're not looked upon, very favorably. You're very looked down upon, right? And that ultimately is a lack of proper culture, right? That's why the scriptures say to seek ye the old paths and walk therein. Where is the good way? Because Jake doesn't understand you have a cultural problem, right? I don't want to get too off topic, but ultimately, that same mindset, when you look at the mass majority of our people, that's what they lack. When you see their different celebrations, and the other nations, they look at you like, are these the people? You know what I'm saying? Like, you know what I'm saying? They look, they're the quickest to cry wolf, but they don't even behave as people who are honorable, right? They've become a degenerate plant of a strange vine, when the Lord created us to be a noble vine. A noble is somebody who has conduct, etiquette, manners. That's the behavior of a prince, because the Lord created us to be a nation of kings and priests, right? So, let me just read down a bit more, and it says here. This is Nehemiah chapter 5. verse 10. And it says, and likewise, my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Please let us stop charging this interest. Excuse me. Please give them back this day their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, and their 100 part of their money, the grain, the new wine, and the oil that you are lending them. And they said, we will give it back and will not require anything from them. We will do exactly as you say. And then I called the priests and took an oath from them that they would act in accordance with this promise. So I shook out the front of my garment and said, so the Most High shake out every man out of his house from his possessions, who does not keep this promise, like this, that you may be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen. And they praised the Lord. Then the people acted in accordance with this promise. Right? So that's pretty much I kind of wanted to touch on in regards to the oppression, right? Because there's many different examples of different prophets that actually touched on the oppression of our own people, like I just read in the book of Jeremiah here, because oppression of people, that people are very, very well known for that. You know what I'm saying? That's what it's the same thing today. They learn these abominable habits. That's why culture really is truly ultimately important, because first and foremost, having that fear of the Lord, because that produces an upright conduct, right? It produces moral upstanding qualities, because if they had that, they wouldn't be trying to oppress the poor in the first place. You know what I'm saying? So that mentality of what these other congregations are doing, it shows within their fruits, within their works, within their deeds. They don't actually have a fear of the Heavenly Father, right? But actually, let me just read this real quick. Let me just read this in regards to how Nehemiah conducted himself. This is really good. Says Nehemiah's example. And it says, moreover, from the day I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, the 20th to the 30th and second year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years, neither I or my relatives ate the governor's food allowance. So there was basically some substance that was allotted to somebody who has that position as a governor, right? And it says here, but the former governors who were in office put me in heavy burdens before me. Who were in office before me put heavy burdens on the people and took food and wine from them, in addition to 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants assumed authority over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of the Most High, right? So, he didn't, basically, knowing that your people are impoverished, I didn't take it as an opportunity to actually oppress the people, to further more heavier financial burdens upon the people, right? So when you see, for example, other congregations, trying to, charge money for, excessive like garments and dresses and prayers and breakdowns, and, give them, what I'm saying? You're basically trying to oppress the poor, right? Because our people are already poor, you know what I'm saying? And when you're poor, you're basically vulnerable, right? So this is just to be able to, to understand that, oppression amongst our own people occurred within our history, right? And having the eyes to see, to know, and be able to understand that these are things that that should not be so, right? So anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this lesson was quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.